This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Jane Angel and I'd like to welcome you to the University of South Australia on behalf of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library and the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. We are delighted to be presenting this public talk and exhibition, A Journey Through the Archive, as part of the 2019 South Australia History Festival. This session is being recorded, so please switch off your phone to silent to avoid any interruptions. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land we meet on today is that of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I would particularly like to welcome Ms. Jill Saunders, Executive Assistant to the late Mr. Hawke, and thank her most sincerely for coming today from Sydney to be with us. Your ongoing support of the BHPML and your presence today means a great deal, Jill. I also welcome today the Honourable Sir Eric Neal, AC, CVO, former Governor of South Australia and patron of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, Professor Joanne Seiss, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Education, Arts and Social Sciences, the Honourable John Hill, UniSA Council, and Alan Bridson, Chief Marketing and Communications Officer. We are pleased to be presenting this event with the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, and I'd like to thank Jacinta Thompson, Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer, for her support. I also thank members of her very able team, Renee Jolly and Cara Zanotti. I'd now like to introduce you to Troy Bramston, Senior Writer at The Australian, contributor to Sky News and prolific political biographer. As a devotee of Prime Ministerial and Presidential Libraries and the author or editor of 9 books examining Australian political leadership, Troy demonstrates the way the BHPML is a working collection, transposing, as he does, research discoveries into political biography. Next year, Troy expects to publish a new biography on Mr. Hawke. Troy, thank you so much for coming from Sydney today to enliven and enrich this presentation. I look forward to your insights shortly. As Manager Academic Library Services at UniSA, I have the very great privilege of managing the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library. And my role today is to introduce you to this significant national resource. I would like to do this firstly by sharing an email I received last Tuesday. The sender, David Benoit, has granted me permission to read it to you. Hi, Sir, Ma'am, Administrator of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library. Would you kindly forward my condolences below to the Hawke family? Thank you. Dear Hawke family, with fondness I recall the genuine warmth and smile former Prime Minister Hawke had for people. My family's sincere and heartfelt condolences on the sad passing of Mr. Hawke, a kind, down-to-earth, jovial and good old mate, a true Australian. I lived and grew up in Papua New Guinea between 1989 to 2004, when Prime Minister Hawke in 1992 paid a visit to the once colonial territory of Australia, where he, in an exemplary fashion as a leader, went out of his way on purpose, disregarding protocol and security, to reach over and across the airport fence in Port Moresby, to shake hands with the common grassroots man that came to greet him with Papua New Guinean warmth and hospitality. What mattered and made an impression on me as a primary school student was that he was a leader of a developed Western nation who, in the typical Aussie down-to-earth nature, bothered to even express and extend that same Aussie warmth to the simple, forgotten, and often downtrodden common people of a developing country. The genuine love, rapport and concern he showed for the grassroots man at the airport was real. It was from his big and warm Aussie heart. I am now 37, living in Europe, and I still remember that scene at the airport in PNG. I've never forgotten that image of Prime Minister Hawke. Thank you for sharing Mr. Hawke with us all, Australians, Papua New Guineans, and the world at large. God Almighty bless you, the family of Prime Minister Hawke. The message was as beautiful as it was moving. And after I'd recovered, what struck me was that David Benoit, in a desire to convey his gratitude and respect, might have chosen to send his condolences to any number of alternate recipients. Perhaps the Parliament or the embassy in his country of residence. He could also have expressed his tribute via the immediacy of a social media platform, as is entirely commonplace nowadays. But David sent it to this library. He entrusted us to deliver the message. There may be several reasons for this, but I wondered if he had done it because he believes, like me, that libraries are trusted institutions representing sources of credible information valued globally for their preservation of knowledge. Libraries provide rich resources for creating new knowledge and have the capacity to facilitate the interpretation and reuse of information in transformative ways. Also, libraries are the keeper of stories, not only the sweeping, but the anecdotal. David had a story to tell, and his story is now connected to ours, as ours is his, embedding itself in an evolving national narrative. The BHPML was the first Prime Ministerial library to be established in Australia during the lifetime of a former Prime Minister, with a Memorandum of Understanding signed between Mr. Hawke and the University on Mr. Hawke's 68th birthday, the 9th of December 1997. The MOU established the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, of which the library was a central tenet, and it sets out the objectives: to recognise the achievements of Australia's second longest and longest serving Labor Prime Minister in his state of birth. The MOU specifies the identification, collection and conservation of the Prime Minister's papers and memorabilia, and with it a requirement to make them accessible for research and public access. The University Library, in turn, has a plan which sets the strategic direction for the responsible and sustainable development and management of a number of special collections, and it currently prioritises the BHPML in order that this national resource continues to contribute to the political and social history of Australia. These are important documents. Yet when I returned to David's email, I thought how succinctly he captured the essence of the library at the end of his message. My warm regards to the library for preserving the memory of the Prime Minister. At the heart of this library is a person. Far from being a static storage facility, its papers, photographs, letters, speeches, cartoons, posters and artefacts contribute to our understanding of the complexity and multidimensionality of an individual, a time, and a nation. It represents legacy, not hagiography. Libraries are life, and the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library is a living biography. It therefore lends itself naturally to researchers and writers. The role of the librarians and archivists in this space is to conserve, collate, promote, and find novel ways to tell and retell aspects of a life by the exhibitions that we mount and the items we prioritise for description and discovery. It is a creative process that involves selection, arrangement, and sometimes deselection to surface and reveal, to personalise and humanise. A life and an era can be explored and interpreted and reinterpreted, examining the life of the individual and commemorating it for those who lived through the times and those who inherit the times. The BHPML reflects Mr. Hawke mostly on either side of his time in government. The wealth of material we hold interconnects with that of a number of other collecting agencies. The National Archives of Australia is the national repository of official Commonwealth records, and as such, it retains papers from Mr. Hawke's time as a Member of Parliament. Collections at the Australian War Memorial, the National Library, and the National Film and Sound Archive are complementary, and further collections intersect and abut. Hazel Hawke's papers, for example, are at Curtin University. Malcolm Fraser's are at the University of Melbourne. The BHPML's unique value is its preservation of content before, during, and after public office. Items that tell a story about the child, the student, the husband and father, as well as ACTU President, Prime Minister, and post-politics, a public figure who continued to lend his voice to topics of the day through speeches and appearances. All of these institutions are linked by a unifying and persistent thread to legacy and collective memory. I have not yet mentioned books. We have them too, of course. And it is fitting that there is a library to honour Mr. Hawke, because the traditional role of libraries has been the custodianship of print books, and Mr. Hawke was a reader who understood deeply the value of reading. As a child, he was routinely at the top of his class. On this subject, he commented, "I had a head start because my parents read to me." Today we have on display a report from West Leederville School dated December 1940, which confirms that he was a very good student, conscientious and consistent across all subjects. A single remark about his conduct reads, "V good, but talks rather too much." In her 1982 biography, Blanche Dalpouge wrote that Mr. Hawke's favourite childhood stories were about the heroes of David and Goliath and of Samson, men who took on seemingly insurmountable opponents and won. It's not a stretch to extrapolate how these stories may have sparked his advocacy in industrial relations and his championing, as testified in David Benoit's email, of those who didn't necessarily have the power or the voice to articulate it for themselves. He was himself a writer of books and memoirs and a formidable orator. Blanche describes several of Mr. Hawke's tour de force orations as president of the ACTU, decrying that there is no contest between the oratory of the trade unions and that of the federal parliament. As public speakers, union officials excel parliamentarians in their sincerity of feeling and their robustness of language. And an ACTU Congress battling over a serious issue is one of the great pieces of theatre in Australian political life. Unhappily, it is all allowed to dissipate, unrecorded, except for a paragraph here and there, which is reported by the news media. But these speeches have not dissipated. They have not disappeared. They are right here in perpetuity for anyone to read. The physical library is to the left of this room through the glass doors, and I encourage you all to visit in time. And of course, we are happy to bring the library to you, wherever you are, via our website and library catalogue. Our current plans for the BHPML are to increase discoverability and access of the collection by establishing digitisation priorities and enabling online use. We want to engage with national and global end users, identify potential research themes, and ensure that the library remains a working collection, contributing to research output and our national story. We will also continue to recognise the intrinsic cultural value of the library, preserving irreplaceable items for future generations so that they may come to it in due course and make their own determinations and project their memories into the future. Please take your time looking at the exhibition here on level 5 that contains many items which have not previously been displayed publicly. There are 4 overarching themes: The Boy from Bordertown, which draws on Mr. Hawke's personal life, childhood, education, family and marriage. And we also give you The Sportsman. Mr. Hawke's love of sport is delineated by a small selection taken from a very large amount of sporting memorabilia housed in the BHPML. Outside of the Bradley Forum, we have the Prime Minister with campaign and election memorabilia that showcase some of the most colourful and memorable moments from Mr. Hawke's career. And I'd like to correct an error in this morning's advertiser which stated they are replicas. They are not. And lastly, in the Man of the People, we display letters, cards and photos of and from everyday Australians with whom Mr. Hawke resonated. Advancing Australia Fair, Bob Hawke and his government, 1983 to 1991, is currently on display in the Kerry Packer Civic Gallery, together with materials and memorabilia relating to Mr. Hawke's life. This exhibition tracks the paradigm shift in Australian values, policies and international relations pursued by Mr. Hawke and his government. Whilst visiting the exhibition, please take the opportunity to sign a memorial book to record your personal tribute to the Honourable Robert James Lee Hawke, ACGCL. A copy will be sent to Mr. Hawke's family as a token of esteem from the Hawke Centre and from all those who have recorded their tributes. Mr. Hawke is sure to be remembered as a man of the people, and I invite you all to share your special memories of him. The Kerry Packer Civic Gallery will remain open until 6:30 this evening. One of the focal points of the exhibition downstairs is a digital homage to Mr. Hawke, curated by Rebecca Bell, a UniSA student and library colleague. Rebecca collaborated with Gillian Yeend, archival librarian, BHPML, to conceive and curate the physical displays for today's event. Gillian's understanding of and commitment to organising and executing the many facets of managing a public event has been unsurpassable. I want to thank Gillian and Rebecca for the passion they have shown in partnering with me on this project. Jenny Jacobs also lent considerable creativity to the exhibition and is responsible for regular displays, including one that is currently outside the library entrance. You're welcome to view that one as well. I also extend my thanks to the wider university library team who helped in a variety of ways, with several who are assisting today. They'll happily guide you through the displays at the end of the presentation. Each of us will respond to items in the exhibition differently because of the experiences we have had and the perspectives that we bring. Where we were then, if we were then, who we were and what we are now. The library will endure through people's engagement with it, an interaction that will expand and shift and deepen the national narrative, engendering new stories and unexpected connections, both personal and public. In closing, here is one of my own. In the 1980s, I was at boarding school in England when my parents were posted to Cape Town. In the holidays, I would travel to see them and needed to present in person at South Africa House in London in order to obtain my visa to enter the country. This meant that at the height of near universal anti-apartheid feeling, I regularly crossed a picket line of protesters to enter the High Commission on Trafalgar Square. This was a very discomforting experience for a teenager. I moved to Australia in the summer of 1987. Mr. Hawke was Prime Minister, my first Prime Minister. Decisions that he was then making contributed significantly to the end of apartheid, but I really wasn't aware of that at all. 3 years later, I was in Cape Town when Nelson Mandela walked free from Victor Verster prison. By then, I had a much better understanding of the role Australia had played in assisting with the immobilisation of this regime and the eventual release of Nelson Mandela. Nearly 30 years later, in December 2018, the library took delivery of a large number of books from Mr. Hawke's personal library. On opening a box, the first I saw was entitled Portrait of a Leader, Nelson Mandela, gifted to Mr. Hawke on the passing of this celebrated statesman and freedom fighter. It is inscribed by the then South African High Commissioner to Australia, Sibusiso Ndebele. To the Honourable Bob Hawke, we will always cherish your role in the struggle for a South Africa free of apartheid. Alone in the Archive, that book connected me to a moment in history, to oppression and liberty, to a kid wanting to go home for the school holidays, and to Bob. Thank you. Thanks very much, and now I'd like to ask Troy to come and take over. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by thanking the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library, especially Jane, for inviting me here today. I'd also like to acknowledge Sir Eric Neal for being here, and other distinguished guests, including the university administrators, Jill Saunders, of course, and I'd also like to acknowledge Nick Bolkus, who I think was here earlier. I have enormous respect and admiration for the work of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library. The vast assortment of personal papers, school and university records, ACTU and Labor Party files, photographs, political memorabilia, gifts and souvenirs, recordings and clothing, all donated by Bob Hawke, is truly one of the great archival collections in Australia. I've had the good fortune to visit here many times over the past 5 years or so while working on several books, but most of all a biography of Bob Hawke. The staff have always been very welcoming and encouraging to me, and I appreciate this very much. Today, as part of the South Australian History Festival, I'd like to talk to you about this magnificent collection, share with you some of the discoveries that I've made, and conclude with some thoughts about Prime Ministerial collections within the context of Bob Hawke's broader life and legacy. We are, of course, meeting here today in the shadow of Bob Hawke's death. I was actually here at the university meeting with Jane on the day that Hawke died. I was absolutely gutted when I heard the news. I had met Bob as a teenager and had experienced his political magic when he gripped my hand, he shook it, and he looked deeply into my eyes. He was charisma personified. He was exceptionally generous to me as a journalist, as a historian, and as his biographer. It has been an immense privilege to formally interview Hawke on more than a dozen occasions over the past decade or so at his home and at his office. It is a great honour to be writing a biography of Bob Hawke, and having conducted a series of interviews with him for the book, I think among the last that he gave, I feel the weight of this responsibility enormously. Bob Hawke was the brightest star in the political galaxy. No other Prime Minister has been more popular, an appeal that transcended generations. No other Prime Minister could say that their government so fundamentally transformed the economic, social and environmental policy settings of Australia. He's Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister, the third longest overall, and he led the party to an unmatched 4 election victories in a row. And he is the only Prime Minister to reach an approval rating of 75%. Hawke's rise to the Prime Ministership was powered by a sense of destiny, unbridled personal ambition, and his determination to turn the country in a new direction. He offered consensus leadership, supported by a unique bond with Australians. He embodied a mix of contradictions and contrasts, but he was an authentic political leader. While ACTU president from 1970 to 1980, he gained a reputation for being a drinker and a womaniser. His emotions, whether revealed by tears or temper, were often in vivid technicolor display. But he never hid who he was or tried to be somebody that he was not. He was a larrikin, down-to-earth, sports-loving union leader and Prime Minister who was also a Rhodes Scholar with a commanding intellect. He roused very strong feelings in the 1970s. Some Australians loathed him, while many others saw him as a political messiah. He gave up the booze, of course, and he moderated his behaviour to become Prime Minister. Believing that ignorance is the enemy of good policy, he placed a premium on political persuasion, whether by logic, reason or passion. He never treated voters like fools. He was also able to skillfully lead a party and a government through periods of profound change at home and abroad while maintaining the support of voters. Now, Gough Whitlam often instructed students, including me, to go to the documents to truly understand political history. I've spent a lot of time in archives in Australia and around the world, and sitting here at the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library, surrounded by boxes of files, offers a window into the past. It's like being Marty McFly and stepping in Doc Brown's time machine and being transported to the past. Stories from Bob Hawke's life come alive through the documents. It can be a truly thrilling experience for a historian. And it's important to evaluate documents that are kept in archives, because some documents that are very important are never kept, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. Sometimes documents have been kept for a reason, to document a decision, as a reference tool, to reinforce a legacy, or just out of habit. Sometimes documents have been shoved into a filing cabinet and have been kept without thinking that they could later serve a historical purpose, and they find their way to places like this. Some documents are valuable, some documents are not so valuable. It depends what you are looking for. So today I want to give you a few examples of the treasures that I have found in my years of research here. Robert James Lee Hawke was born in the small country town of Bordertown on December 9, 1929. The birth register held here in the library lists Hawke as number 241A/168. His father, Clem, was a congregational minister, and his mother, Ellie, was a schoolteacher. In 1935, the family moved to Maitland on the York Peninsula. The library has a hand-drawn calendar that Hawke presented to his parents in 1938. It says, "To mother and father from Bobby." Now that's important because it tells you that even then he was known not as Bob or Robert, but Bobby. Hawke acknowledged that he often coasted through school, and his Maitland Primary School report card in 1938 contained this warning: "Bob is capable of very good work, but would have attained higher marks but for his carelessness." So it worked, and by the end of that year he went from third in the class to first. And his West Leederville State School report card in 1940, as Jane mentioned, also saw him pass all subjects with a consistently good effort, they said, but his teacher did note that he talked rather too much. Now, Ellie was a prominent member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and enlisted Robert into its youth wing called the Band of Hope. Hawke's membership certificate from the Temperance Legion in 1939 is part of the library collection. He broke his mother's heart when he took a strong liking to the amber ale after tasting it for the first time when at a University of Western Australia law faculty dinner in 1949. Hawke's political ascendancy, he was told, was a matter of destiny. Ellie believed that her son would lead the nation one day. Hawke was showered with love and made to believe that he was special. While Hawke did not see the divine hand of God in his journey, he did feel that he was being favoured with some kind of guidance, is the word he used with me. And when a motorbike accident nearly killed him at age 17, he felt that his life had been spared for a reason and he was going to make the most of it. This was a critical turning point in his life. A replica of that bike, a 1939 British Panther Model 100, is located here in Adelaide at the library. But the original bike has recently been rediscovered and restored and is on display at the Bob Hawke Gallery in Bordertown. After graduating from Perth Modern, Hawke joined the Labor Party in 1947 while studying at university. He won election as President of the Student Representative Council, and he graduated with law and arts degrees. There are several Guild Council photos in the library collection, always with a happy and very smiling Bob Hawke taking pride of place. Hawke was also deeply religious in these years, and he joined the Congregational Youth Fellowship. But he lost the faith on a student trip to India in 1952, when he witnessed widespread poverty. Hawke's handwritten diary and his notebook from that trip to India is part of the collection here in this library. Now, so are two curious pamphlets that Hawke kept from that trip to India. The first promoted a golden opportunity to take advantage of the latest scientific advancement to eliminate sexual disappointment, troubles and worries. A special consultant in downtown Bangalore offered their services between 8 and 11 a.m. in the morning and 3 and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, where you could learn how to, quote, improve your personality enough to make your sweetheart admire and adore you and impel her to be inseparably attached to you. Now, a second pamphlet attached to Bob's diary from 1952 advertised a book that held hidden secrets to sexual pleasure, with instructions that followed, if they were followed, guaranteed complete satisfaction. Now, I'll leave it up to your imagination to decide whether Hawke took advantage of these services or not. He enjoyed his time immensely at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, where he gained a Bachelor of Letters for writing a thesis on wage fixation. Hawke had impressed the selection committee when he applied for a Rhodes Scholarship in 1952. The judge's report, also located here, concluded that he was an outstanding leader who was exceptionally adaptable and would take full advantage of his time at Oxford. And that he did. Among his many feats at Oxford, sporting and academic, is also the record that he broke for drinking a tankard of beer, that's 2.5 pints, in 11 seconds. A feat that he said endeared him to the Australian people as much as anything else he achieved for the rest of his life. The library holds several copies of Hawke's thesis on, and I quote, the role of the Australian Commonwealth Court of Conciliation and Arbitration, with special reference to the development of the concept of a basic wage, which he submitted in 1955. And after Oxford, Hawke spent several years at the Australian National University, working on a PhD and teaching. He also began assisting the ACTU with wage cases, and he secured a full-time position with the ACTU in 1958 as research officer and advocate. His victory for the unions in the basic wage case in 1959 earned him public admiration, and his star began to rise. In 1963, Hawke stood as the Labor candidate for the Victorian seat of Corio, but he lost that seat to the Liberal Party's Hubert Opperman, a former Olympic cyclist. There is some great campaign material in the library from Bob's Corio candidacy in 1963, including a flyer with a very handsome young Bob on the front that says inside, Bob Hawke is one of the most capable men to stand for federal parliament. He is the kind of man that Corio needs. He has youth, education, experience, vigour and integrity. And another flyer says that Bob is standing for you in Corio, so give him a seat. Now, Hawke lost Corio. He lost Corio even though there was a swing to the Labor Party. And Bob said to me, of course, many years later, that was the best thing that ever happened to him in his life. Because while Labor remained in opposition, Hawke's star continued to rise in the industrial and political movement. He won a ballot for the ACTU presidency in 1969, defeating Harold Souter by 399 to 350 votes, with the support of left-wing trade unions. The library includes several papers related to Hawke's election as president, including a how to vote card and a flyer titled Why Bob Hawke Should Be ACTU President. This flyer argued that Hawke had the talents, the dedication, the loyalty and the youthful vigour, there's that word again, to channel the energies of the trade union movement into creating a force for good in the community. Now, there are extensive files in the library from Bob's time at the ACTU. This includes letters, research files, submissions, reports, and newspaper clippings. He also joined Labor's federal executive in 1971 and was federal president of the Labor Party from 1973 to 1978. There is also another valuable collection of papers relating to meetings of Labor's federal executive in the 1970s. And it was interesting for me to read a series of speeches that Bob gave following the dismissal of the Whitlam government, where he urged workers not to take a general strike. Now, no other person in Australian history has been talked about as a future Prime Minister as much as Bob Hawke. The idea was first being written about in the early 1960s. And he eventually took the plunge into politics when he won the seat of Wills in 1980. But he was reluctant to give up the ACTU presidency, then often described as the second most important job in Australia. And among many of the ACTU papers is a collection of Hawke's very difficult announcement that he was leaving the union movement and going into politics. And you can see his tortured mind as he's making changes to the press statement that would be given and the speech that he gave to ACTU affiliates. But Bob was elected as the member for Wills in 1980, and Bill Hayden sent him a telegram, which I found here in the library. And that telegram says, "Look forward to seeing you in Canberra, Bob." Well, I think Hayden would soon regret that telegram as Hawke began stalking his leadership of the Labor Party in earnest. And after surviving a leadership challenge in 1982, Hayden was persuaded to make way for Hawke in 1983. Malcolm Fraser called an election on the same day that Labor swapped Hayden for Hawke. Hawke promised to bring Australians together with consensus-style leadership. Labor won a 25-seat majority in 1983, which is its greatest electoral triumph since John Curtin's victory in 1943. His overarching vision for Australia was to have a more competitive and productive economy and a compassionate society at home, and be a more independent and respected nation abroad. The library helps tell the story of these momentous times through collections of Hawke's speeches at home and abroad, caucus minutes from the time he entered Parliament, Labor Party conference reports and minutes, campaign materials such as strategy documents, travel itineraries and opinion polling. And there's also a great collection of Time and Bulletin magazine covers which illustrate the many ups and downs of Hawke's prime ministership. The economic reforms were groundbreaking: the float of the dollar, deregulating the financial system, slashing tariffs, overhauling the tax system and privatising assets. These changes laid the basis for 3 decades of economic growth. The budget was also structurally repaired. Spending was cut in real terms, which produced 4 surpluses, the first since the 1950s. An accord with unions moderated wage claims in return for social wage benefits. And the social policies themselves were also transformative. The reintroduction of universal health care, Medicare, is now sacrosanct. Welfare spending was better targeted to those Australians in low socio-economic cohorts and saw their living standards improve dramatically. School retention rates more than doubled, the university and college sectors rapidly expanded, and his environmental legacy is also substantial. Stopping the Franklin Dam in Tasmania, setting up land care, saving the Daintree rainforest in Queensland, and helping to safeguard Antarctica from mining. Hawke wanted Australia to be a creative middle power, punching above its weight on the world stage. He was one of the last Cold War leaders. He forged good relations with Ronald Reagan and George Bush and strengthened the ANZUS alliance. He enthusiastically supported the First Gulf War and he sent military forces abroad. He also prioritised relations in the Asia-Pacific with the APEC Multilateral Trade Forum. He used the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting to press South Africa to abolish apartheid and often infuriated Margaret Thatcher with his insistence as he advocated for Nelson Mandela's release from jail. Now, all Prime Ministers make mistakes and they have regrets. And Hawke told me that the 2 things that most troubled him was misreading the economy, which led to a recession, and not doing more to advance Aboriginal land rights. Hawke's official papers as Prime Minister, plus his cabinet documents, are located in Canberra at the National Archives of Australia. But I think there's a good case for bringing them here, so that all of Hawke's papers concerning his Prime Ministership are together in the one place. Some of the archival treasures that I've mentioned are on display here today, and some of them have never been seen public before. These new items, as Jane mentioned, focuses on Bob's personal life, election campaigns, his love of sport, and his relationship with Australians. They include golf clubs gifted by George Bush Sr., Olympic team tracksuits, and a replica of Australia's America's Cup jacket. There's also campaign T-shirts, posters, stickers, badges, and of course the wedding clothes worn by Bob and Blanche in 1995. I encourage you to look at the trove of letters, cards and photos that have been sent to Hawke over the years that show how much he was loved and admired by everyday Australians. Now, the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library is one of several Prime Ministerial libraries and institutes established in Australia. Regrettably, there's no coordinated approach within government for supporting Prime Ministerial libraries and institutes, and public funding has often been allocated on an ad hoc basis. I think the best model for this is the US Presidential Library system, which was established by Franklin Roosevelt. There are 14 official presidential libraries, which house the personal and official papers of presidents. The research components of these libraries are run by the US National Archives and Records Administration, while the museums and events are often funded and operated privately. I'm a big fan of presidential libraries. I've visited 9 of them, including several with young kids in tow. They love them too, I think. And I hope there's more Prime Ministerial libraries established in Australia in partnership with universities. When I last saw Bob Hawke a few months ago, it was clear to me that he was ready to go. He had lived a long life, just shy of reaching his 90th birthday. And so sitting with Hawke on the balcony of his sprawling multi-level home, overlooking Sydney Harbour on a bright sunny day, he smoked a cigar and he sipped on a strawberry milkshake. He wore beige golf pants with a shiny tracksuit over the top of a white polo shirt. His eyes were a duller blue than usual, and his hair, once that magnificent luxuriant mane, was thinning, it was wider, and it was losing its distinctive curly shape. He would rather be doing the crossword than answering another round of questions from me, which Jill can attest to. But he did answer my questions, and he was brief in his responses, but he was also very reflective. I asked again about his parents, especially his father, and he said to me his father was a marvellous man. He always looked for good in people and he was a very big influence on me. I liked him, I loved him, he was my best mate. And he spoke about how much he deeply loved Hazel and regretted not being a better father or husband. In previous interviews, he had acknowledged his infidelity and the impact of the demon drink on their marriage. And he described his relationship with Hazel as the most important in my life at that time. He also deeply loved Blanche. He said that Blanche was the best thing that ever happened to him, and she was the light of his life. Hawke had spent a lifetime trying to convince us that he was a simple, dinky-die Australian, but in truth, he was complex. We all are. And in recent years, he also mended any lingering rifts with Paul Keating. They were Australia's greatest political duo. They were also rivals, and they sometimes had contempt for one another, but there was also mutual admiration and warmth between them. Bob said to me, "We did a lot of great things together, and affection is not an inappropriate word now for my relationship with Paul." In his final years, Hawke was not particularly interested in promulgating a legacy or dwelling on any regrets. He was at peace with himself and with others, and now he's gone. But what remains is all around us. The remarkable contribution that he made to Australia with lasting reforms to the economy, huge advances in social policy, and an admirable record on environmental protection, and also playing an important role on the world stage. And what also remains is his personal papers here at the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library. They help document, explain, and illuminate the life and legacy of one of Australia's most important Prime Ministers, and I encourage you all to explore it here today and into the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Troy. I don't think I was wrong when I predicted that would be a very enriching presentation. And I think you've perfectly illustrated what a treasure trove that the archive is, and also some of the painstaking research you've done, but also some of the delight that serendipity plays. So thank you very much, Troy. That was brilliant. We've got some time for questions, if anybody would like to ask any. We've got a couple of roving microphones. Gillian has one here. Rebecca has one on the other side of the room. And then you'll be very welcome to have a look around the displays and exhibitions.
Hi, my question is a general one. When is the book due to be published? Or is that too difficult at this stage?
No, it's not too difficult. The key challenge is I've got to finish writing it. So as soon as I finish writing it, then it'll be ready. But look, I expect to have it finished by early next year. I've done a lot of not only archival research here and overseas, but interviews with a lot of Bob's former colleagues, including some that are quite elderly now, including Bill Hayden and others. And I also had an opportunity to interview George Bush Senior, which Bob helped to organise, and he's gone now as well. So look, I've just got to get my skates on and finish the thing, but it's not too far away.
Thanks.
Troy will probably be back. He's probably our most frequent visitor to the library and knows it better than most.
Just a question on where did all the stuff come from? Who kept it? Did his mum keep it, or did Bob keep it, or who kept it all? I had a mother who threw away stuff.
Well, that's very sad. I'm sorry to hear that. It's come from all sorts of different and original places. So some of it did come from the family. When the library was first set up, about 360 odd boxes came from the National Archives in Canberra. We've also had quite a few donations over the years from Mr. Hawke's office in Sydney. So in December we received around 60 boxes, and we expect to receive some other boxes soon. Yes. Jill's been packing up the office for some time. I've seen it, and floor to ceiling. So we'll have all sorts of incredible items to add to our collection over the years.
Thanks, Troy, for the excellent insight into the life of Bob Hawke. I've got a question. You mentioned about the powerful duo, Paul and Bob. And I just would like to know, from your own experience, what were the characteristics that Bob brought to that relationship to make it that powerful duo? So what are the ingredients needed for that at the Australian political level?
Well, look, in many ways and I wrote about this in the biography that I wrote of Paul Keating a couple of years ago. A lot of people have said to me over the years, they must hate each other. Well, they've never hated each other. That's often a mistake. They were rivals, of course, for the leadership, and Paul Keating wanted to succeed Bill Hayden as Labor leader and thought that Bob Hawke had lived another life and was jumping into Parliament at the last minute. And, he should get back in the queue is a sort of a term that Keating would use. But their styles complemented each other. On all the policy issues of the 1980s, they were almost always in agreement. The only time they really disagreed was around the tax summit in 1985, where they had some disagreements there, and that did lead to a fracture in their relationship. But most of the time they were in agreement on policy issues. I'll make a couple of quick comments further. Look, I was interested to go back and look at some of the papers of the shadow cabinet between 1980 and 1983, and some of the diaries that have been held by people at that time, like Neil Blewett and Barry Jones and others. And when there was a big debate about reforming the Australian economy and opening it up and floating the dollar and things like that, there were only two members of the shadow cabinet led by Bill Hayden who supported those policies, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. So they were of a like mind on many things. The other thing is that their styles complemented each other very well. So, Bob said he didn't really like speaking in Parliament. He didn't think it was a great forum for him. He was more used to being an advocate, speaking in large rallies, speaking in tribunals, good in interviews and things like that. Keating, of course, revelled in Parliament. And so they had a different style in Parliament. Keating was very combative. Bob was often sometimes quite demure in Parliament. Keating would often be very outspoken and forceful in cabinet meetings, but Bob would always be the chairman of the board, seeking consensus, asking everyone to have their say, summing up at the end, trying to reach a decision that everyone could live with. There's quite an age gap between the two of them as well. I mean, Bob's born in 1929, Keating's born in 1944. One's from Victoria, essentially where he was the Member of Parliament from, and had lived as ACTU president. Keating's in New South Wales. So they're very, very different personalities and different backgrounds, and those styles complemented each other very well in government, I think. And they were often on the same page on issues.
Troy, like you, I've been fortunate to visit a number of presidential libraries in the United States, and here, I mean, they're great collections and they all particularly reflect the individual characteristics of the president, but also the time in which they served. Here, I think it's fair to say, to the extent that prime ministerial collections are held, more often than not, they're in universities. But you mentioned about greater coordination, and this might be a question for both of you, is how can we build on the work, and, a bit biased, but I think we're doing great work here in the Hawke Centre, but how can we build the profile of those collections nationally and also for each Prime Minister? What do you think the next steps are that need to be taken to grow the stature of these centres to be comparable to the presidential libraries in the US?
It's probably easier for me to mention because I can be much franker than Jane. Look, often these presidential libraries are magnificent, huge museums attached to them, programs every day of the week, great for school kids, learning about democracy and civics and things like that. A lot of them are funded by private donations, and we don't have that kind of sense of huge philanthropy here where, there's millions and millions of dollars raised all the time and given by big corporations. So it's going to be hard to establish that kind of model here. But the Whitlam Institute does a great job at Western Sydney. The John Howard Library's been established at Old Parliament House. They've got a great collection there as well. And then there are others like the Malcolm Fraser papers, which are just kind of in a small room. And I was recently looking at Melbourne University, I was recently looking at his book collection. They've set aside a room there where all of Fraser's books are. But we can be doing much better. I think the way to do it is government. I think the government needs to step in here and provide ongoing funding to these prime ministerial libraries. They need to offer money to other prime ministers who don't have institutions established in their name, such as Paul Keating or Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd or even Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull. Turnbull will probably fund his own presidential scale library, no doubt, for his brief prime ministership. But anyway, look, I do think it's got to be government led, and I wrote a column about this in the Australian some months ago. The Howard Library, which I support and is doing a great job, got $13.5 million in the last budget, and that was just a one-off ad hoc amount. And I'm not critical of them funding that kind of money for that kind of purpose, but it should be a more systematic approach. The same kind of money and funding should be offered to other existing prime ministerial libraries and ones that haven't been established before. So, short answer to your question is, I think it's got to be government-led.
In the interest of diplomacy, I'm going to leave it there and say we've got time for one more question. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hi. My question is, from all your interviews with Bob, I mean, he's lived an incredibly privileged life. He's managed to keep his grounding with the common people. What would you, of all things and all the conversations you've had, attribute that to?
Look, it's a great question because you've come across the most important aspect of Bob Hawke's life and the reason for his success, and that is that he loved Australian people He loved the Australian people. He loved meeting them. He loved being around them. He loved talking to them. He paid attention to them no matter where you were, you know, at a campaign rally, at a supermarket, in his office for a formal meeting. It didn't matter. He loved being among the Australian people. And I explored this very topic with Bob in a couple of interviews, and I said, well, you know, what is it? And he said, well, I just loved people and they loved me. And the reason is because they saw him as authentic and genuine. And I told that story about as a teenager shaking his hands and his eyes going deep into my eyes. And it sounds a bit strange, but to be honest, the rest of the room blurred to me. I couldn't hear anything meeting Bob for the first time. I just saw him looking at me, and he was intensely looking at me and was interested in everything I had to say, which was probably irrelevant as a teenager. But that just showed that kind of connection he could establish with people. And it was genuine and he felt it. It wasn't learnt. He had a touch, a magic touch for politics. He said to me once that he couldn't understand that so many of his fellow politicians actually didn't like people, didn't like meeting people, didn't feel comfortable. It's not that they didn't like people, but they didn't like the politics of it. They didn't like the hand-to-hand nature of politics, didn't feel comfortable meeting people and relaxed and were all that interested in their fellow Australians. And that was how Bob saw it. And of course, his colleagues, including Keating, would often deride what they called as the great love affair with the Australian people. But it was genuine. He felt it and they felt it towards him. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why he was Prime Minister for so long and so successful.
Thanks, Troy. That's a great answer. Well, I think that really brings us to the end of the session. I want to again thank Troy so much for sharing his incredible breadth of knowledge and understanding of Mr. Hawke with us, and to thank you all very much for coming today. And I hope that you enjoy the exhibition and the displays, both on level 5 and level 3. And Troy will be here afterwards if you want to ask him any other questions. So thank you very much.